Have you ever wondered why poets and musicians are so skilled? How the words and music flow like a river into the pools of your hearts and minds? Well, the people of the cold and freezing north might just have their own answer to those questions. Welcome back, my friends. I am Drust, and today I have a different story for you. This story comes from the lands of the Northmen, from Norse mythology. A tale of a wise man brought down by the hubris and jealousy of others, but in a roundabout way, giving his gifts to man and to every poet you can ever think of. Today, my friends, I present to you Kvasir and the Mead of poetry. Long ago, there was a war between the gods of Asgard and the gods of Vanaheim. They have been fighting for a good few years, but then loomed the threat of the Jotnar giants from Jotunheim. The Aesir and the Vanir put aside their differences and focused on the main threat of the Jotnar, and after beating them back, they had come together in a truce. You see it now when the inclusion of the gods Freya and Freyr are included in the halls of Asgard. And one day in Asgard, all the gods, both Aesir and Vanir alike, came together to have a fantastic feast with mead and fine food. It was all sorts of merriment. And at the head of this gathering, at the very high seat of Asgard, there was Odin, the All-Father. And he, in his infinite wisdom, devised a way to help solidify the peace. Odin picked up a bowl, and then he spat into this very bowl. And he encouraged the other gods to pass around this bowl and to do what he had done, to spit into this bowl. He gave it to Tyr, who spat into the bowl. He gave it to Thor, who spat in the bowl, and he passed it on to Sif, to Freya, to Freyr, to Heimdall. Everyone had a chance to spit into this bowl. And when it finally came back to Odin, he used his divine magics to make this form into the likeness of a person. And that person is called Kvasir, who is the catalyst of this story. Now, Kvasir was the wisest man on earth, second only to the All-Father himself. And he possessed great knowledge. Everybody would ask him a question, and he would know the answer. No matter how cryptic the question was, no matter how deep and personal the question was, Kvasir knew the answer. And the gods had so much fun with this, and they enjoyed being in Kvasir's presence, and he did enjoy being in Asgard. But there was a slight itch to Kvasir. He wanted to go out into the 9 worlds to share his knowledge with everyone, and maybe even learn something himself along the way. So he approached the All-Father with his dilemma, hoping that he would have permission to go out into the 9 worlds. Now, Odin, being a fellow lover of knowledge, said to Kvasir, "Then you shall go beyond the 9 worlds, spread your knowledge, and you will always have a home here in Asgard." And so he did. Kvasir went to all the 9 worlds to spread his wisdom and knowledge. And he ended up in Midgard. Midgard being where mankind lives. And mankind really loved Kvasir the same way that the gods of Asgard did. Once again, he would be asked questions and he would know the answer. And he was a very beloved man. Everybody loved Kvasir. Well, nearly everybody. For you see, there were 2 dwarfs called Fjalar and Gulla, 2 brothers who absolutely despised Kvasir. They were jealous of his knowledge, and they were jealous of everyone's devotion towards him. One day, Fjalar said to Gulla, "It is said, brother, that the blood of Kvasir is magical. They say that whoever tastes upon it will become a great poet. I think we should acquire this blood." And the 2 brothers set upon a plan. They invited Kvasir to their home. Now, Fjalar and Gulla lived in a cave overlooking the sea, but it was dark and dingy and what most people would expect a dwarf to live in. But Kvasir didn't judge. He was more than welcome to converse with these dwarves, so he came into their cave and they sat down and they shared a drink, and then it began with the questions. Fjalar would ask a question, Kvasir would answer. And they kept at this for a good long while, but something was off. And before Kvasir could even react to his gut feelings, Galar went behind him and cut his throat. That was the first stage of the brothers' plan. What they did next was to bleed Kvasir dry of all of his blood, and they gathered it into a vat. Then they mixed it with honey and produced mead. And this became the mead of poetry. Now those 2 bloodthirsty brothers, they hoarded and kept this great treasure to themselves. And as the years went on, they became crueler and crueler. But this is not the end of the mead of poetry. For you see, one day, Fjalar and Gulla were entertaining a giant called Gillingur and his wife. But being a giant, he ate a lot of their food, and the 2 brothers got very annoyed. And what do those 2 do? They decide to get rid of him. They invite him to go fishing, so they went in a big long boat out into the deepest part of the ocean, so deep and so dark that you can't see the bottom. And they asked Gillingur to look over the edge of the boat to check if there is any fish. And Gillingur, not knowing any better, did so. The dwarfs then rocked the boat back and forth until finally the giant tips over and falls into the water and drowns. But they don't just stop at Gillingur. They went back to their cave to relay the news to his wife. And while she was in the pangs of grief, they drop a rock from a cliff onto her head and kill her. And they thought they had got rid of the problem. And they were content in knowing that they were not going to be bothered anymore. But Gillingur had a son called Sotungur, and he wanted revenge against the dwarves. So he took the dwarves out to sea and was about to drown them in the same way as they had drowned his father. But the 2 dwarves pleaded with Sotungur, promising that he could have their famous mead of poetry if only he would spare their lives. But Sotungur was still enraged with them and wanted to see them suffer. So he took them to a small rock crevice in the middle of the ocean and deposited the dwarves on there, stating,
I will not forgive you. You will stay here and drown and suffer like my father.
And fully satisfied, he rode back to their cave, collected the mead of poetry for himself, and returned to his home in Jotunheim. But news of this mead of poetry reached the ears of the All-Father via his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, Thought and Memory. And he pieced two and two together. Whether out of respect for Kvasir or just his ultimate thirst for knowledge, Odin wanted that mead. Now, the All-Father would always travel the 9 worlds to gain knowledge, but he would always do it in disguise. He would never walk into any part of the 9 worlds as himself, for he had many enemies. When he heard about the mead of poetry, he disguised himself and adopted the name Bolverk and went down to Jotunheim. On his travels in Jotunheim, he encountered Baugi. Now, Baugi was another giant, but he was the brother of Suttungr, and he asked the All-Father his name and his business. And the All-Father replied, "My name is Bolverk, and I wish for an invitation to Suttungr's fort to partake in some of the mead of poetry. Do you think that is possible?" And Baugi responded,
Good luck with that. I am his own brother, and I have never even had a single drop of his famous mead. He guards it very well. It is guarded by his daughter, Gunnlod, and she obeys Suttungr's every command. If you're willing to try, I can get you an invitation. Work for me. Work for me until the winter. I have a harvest to bring in. If you work for me until the winter, I can take you personally to Suttungr's fort, and you can ask him that question yourself.
Bolverk agreed, and he worked Baugi's fields until the winter, when he had brought in all the harvest. And after some time, Baugi took Bolverk on his honor to Suttungr's fort, which was carved into one of the giant mountains of Jotunheim. Bolverk approached Suttungr and asked the same question about how he would like to taste some of the mead of poetry. But Suttungr refused and immediately asked him to leave. Baugi was more than willing to just give up this approach and go back home. But the All-Father had another plan. He gave Baugi a drill called Rati, and said that if you were to drill into the side of the mountain, that the drill would make a hole big enough to enter without the need for Suttungr's permission. Baugi thought a minute, but ultimately agreed. So they went to the side of a mountain that was very unguarded. And Baugi started to drill. And he kept drilling and drilling and drilling until finally he thought he had gone through to the other side. And when he stopped, he looked and saw that it was only a few centimeters wide. How was he, a massive giant, going to fit in that? And he turned around to ask Bolverk what this was. But Bolverk was missing, and in his place was a snake. Odin had transformed himself into a snake, and as quick as a flash, he started heading towards the hole. Baugi, in a fury, tried to grab the serpent, but the serpent was too cunning and slipped through his hands, and as soon as he entered the hole, Baugi tried to use the drill, to try and capture the serpent, but it was too quick, and he went through into the small hole into the mountain, leaving Baugi stamping and crying with rage. On the other side of the mountain, Odin transformed back into his normal self, his normal disguised self, and he came across the 3 massive vats that contained the mead of poetry. And sitting in front of them was a giantess, a fairly beautiful giantess. This was Gunnlod, Sutunga's daughter. Now, the Allfather was not just powerful in his magical abilities, he was also a very cunning man. And he had a way with words and a way with women. He approached Gunnlod and bedazzled her with his words and flattery, but she knew that she couldn't let her father down. But she was still very tempted by this strapping man, this bulwark, standing in front of her. And she said and proposed an ultimatum. She would allow Bulwark to have 3 sips of the mead of poetry, only if he would spend 3 nights with her. 3 nights, 3 draughts each. And Bulwark agreed. The first night, they had a very pleasant conversation, got on very well, and then Bulwark had the first sip. Then the next night, they were a bit more flirtatious and a bit more involved with each other, and then Bulwark had the second sip. And on the third night, they made love, and that was the last night. And Odin took the third sip of the mead of poetry. Now, when Odin takes a sip, he takes a very big sip, more of like a gulp than a sip. But he passed it off as a sip due to some form of magic. What he actually did was drain each of the 3 vats dry. And Gunnlod realized what has happened and what she had done, and she quickly ran to tell her father, Sutunga, about what has happened. Odin, filled with mead, knew he had to act fast, so he transformed himself into an eagle and made his way out through the roof of the mountain and started heading towards Asgard. Sutunga, having realized what had happened, transformed himself into an eagle as well and started heading after Odin in eagle form. And they flew and flew, just barely catching up with each other until finally they reached Asgard. And all the other gods had realized that the eagle coming towards them was Odin. And they started preparing these vats to put this mead into. Now, as Odin was flying over the 9 worlds, some of the mead from his mouth fell out and little droplets started to fall down into Midgard. But when he eventually got to Asgard, he landed and started to produce all this mead and fill the 3 vats. But Sutunga was in hot pursuit and almost fell upon him to try and catch him in his talons, but in pure shock and haste, Odin produced some of the mead from out of his anus. And that happened to splash Sutunga right in the face, and some of that even fell down into Midgard. And when Sutunga crash landed into Asgard, the gods had their weapons ready and they killed him on the spot. The mead of poetry had been secured. Another Jotnar was defeated, and the gods rejoiced. Odin, a bit more worse for wear, but he was alright. He always is, being the All-Father and all. Now a little note. The mead that fell out of Odin's mouth in eagle form, when it fell to Midgard, it became the mead of poetry. That was the original form. The stuff that came out of the back end was considered very low par and substandard mead. It was often known as the rhymester's share because nearly everybody would have had it. But those very few that tasted the real original mead of poetry, they would have the gifts and abilities to be a great poet, or skald, if we're talking about the sort of Norse tradition here. And that is the story of the mead of poetry. The first ever of the Norse myths I ever heard. And it is one of my favourites, for it has many interweaving storylines and they all come full circle in a roundabout way. For example, Odin created Kvasir, and he was the one who sent him out into the 9 worlds. But Odin managed to gather him back again, and Kvasir in a roundabout way ended up coming back to Asgard, but just not in the form that he left in. And as previously stated, it's because of Kvasir that we end up having this inspirational story about explaining how poets and every person who has ever had any form of inspiration and is very good at what they do have received their skills. But thank you for listening to this story. If you would like me to tell Norse stories again, along with more folklore and Celtic myth, then make sure to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. Safe travels, my friends. See you soon.